And I'll start again. So this is going to be a mismatch of just Groovy Grails features, just to kind of fill some time, because my other talk, which I'm doing for the conference, I have to try to fit it to 50 minutes. So I want to, basically I figured that this we usually go for 2 hours or so. So I have the Who Am I, which is just because I copied this from my other presentation. Obviously, I'm Tucker Pelletier, virtual dog burp pretty much everywhere. And obviously we're doing the Boston Groovy Grails meetup, which I'll be advertising when I'm at the conference. And let's see, so just some announcements. Great Comp is next month. You can still get tickets if you want to go. I think it was the pricing, it goes up after the end of this month. Right now it's $500 for a ticket, and it's in Minneapolis. Also, I released my Grails command plugin. That's gone 4.0, and I will be releasing my 2.0 plugin soon. That one I just have to finish up some documentation, and those will be kind of talked about in my security talk. And just as a general rule, I asked if there's any announcements from the floor, kind of like what KneeJug does, just to see if anybody's looking for people or stuff like that. So any announcements? I need a cricket chirping sound effect, I guess. All right. So the code, I will post these slides. As you'll notice, there's a whole bunch of links in these slides that you'll be able to click on and go to more information and stuff like that. But the code will be here at my little test project that I have, which is based off my Enforcer stuff. I just kind of expanded the app to do a whole bunch of other things. So basic overview, we already went through announcements. We're going to go through a little bit of guide and documentation because there's a lot of guides that are very useful, so I'm kind of just going to point you to those. There's profiles, which are something that came in 3. YAML and the fix to that. I'm going to talk about some traits, a little bit about Gradle, JSON Views, Interceptors, events, some Spring Boot features, and a little bit about data services, which I just learned recently because I watched the talk and it's like, oh, that's cool, and now I know why you'd want to use it because I saw the brief overview at a conference, and it's like, I'm not sure why I'd want to use that, but once I saw the talk, it's like, oh, that's why. So these, basically just a bunch of links where you can see what's been added with what different version. The links to the guides, which are very useful. They put them out every Monday now, so that is definitely something to check out because they have guides for all kinds of crazy stuff at this point. So check those out. I also added, just for ha-has, my Grails architecture diagrams, which are horrible color-wise because my sense of color is not that great, but I put these up and I actually put them into the public domain so anyone can take them, modify them, and hopefully something to this something of this ilk will eventually end up in the documentation. So there'll be some kind of layout of what is a Grails 3 the Grails architecture, because you have your Tomcat, which has GSP, and this looks horrible on the monitor, but it looks better on when you have it on a laptop. Asset pipeline, JSON Views, you have Interceptors, URL mappings, controllers, services, domains. You have Gradle, which everything's built on. Spring, which is what it sits on top of. Spring Boot. You have plugins, configuration, Groovy, Java, JVM. So, and then I also went a little bit further down and made another one that kind of shows you some of the innards of where things are in Grails, including command objects, which are very useful if you don't know what those are, because a lot of people have skipped over those, but they can be very useful. And when I get into my security talk, I will talk about the command plugin, which makes those a little bit more useful. So profiles, these came in I think 3.0. But these allow you to get up and running with a whole bunch of different types of applications rather quickly. They basically just bootstrap a lot of the process for you. And there's this thing called Application Forge, which I'll actually click on that, go there, and let's zoom in. You can actually, well, too much, it blew it out. You can actually, pick your, what the project type is, the version you want, and profile, which determines what features it has. But you can like add and remove features to it. Like say you wanted just like the regular web one, but you also wanted JSON Views, which are very have become popular because they're very useful. You could add that, and it'll generate something up for you, and you can download it. So let's go back. So basically, it's just a better way of bootstrapping the whole process. However, if you mix and match features from different profiles, sometimes things won't work quite right, and you might have to finagle with the dependencies, which is what I had to do with the test application which I'm using, which is all the code that you see in here is based off of. So you'll see, in there, like, some things I've added just so that I could get things actually working. Because if you start with like say an Angular profile and you add like GSP because I wanted it for something else, one of the things it doesn't add is the controller, the URL mapping for those. So it's like, why isn't this different URL mappings? Because they made the Angular one very REST compliant URLs versus the traditional controller. Controller action URLs. So that's something just to keep in mind if you play around with those. YAML and the fix. The default in Grails 3 is to use YAML as the default for all your configuration, which I personally hate, because it's like you took JSON, which is a fine format, and you added significant white space, which I'm not a big fan of. This can be replaced with a Groovy a Groovy representation, which is the application.groovy, or and you can also supplement that with the runtime.groovy, because in Grails 3, I think it was 3.2, they made it so that the application one is the one that runs when you just do any command line based thing. So if you do, so a lot of the Grails application isn't ready yet. So if you try to run code that's outside of that scope, it'll crash. So they made runtime.groovy, which allows you to actually run things that are within the scope of your application. Which for certain things, like say you had an external file for say database credentials that's encrypted, and you wanted to use something to decrypt them, then you might want to do that in your runtime.groovy, because you'd be able to actually access that. And then for plugins, you still have the plugin.groovy, but there's also this external config plugin, which I contributed a YAML to Groovy converter, so that instead of doing this manually, which is kind of a pain, you can just run this script and it'll convert whatever YAML you put it at to a Groovy configuration instead. So traits. So there's a lot of things changed in Groovy to be trait based. So now one of the things that you have is like a lot of the, actually, let's see if it has those. So a lot of the artifacts, like the domain class, the controller class, were enhanced before by runtime metaprogramming, and then eventually in Grails 2 they had compile time metaprogramming, which was harder to maintain. But then Groovy added traits, which replaced a lot of that, which were a lot of the compile time metaprogramming, which is easier to just maintain, and the fact that you get IDE support from it out of the box. So a lot of the methods that you take advantage of in your controllers and services that are just there by default, you can now actually debug into them and actually do things like in the Eclipse binding I know is F3, which is what I have on my IntelliJ, so I'm not sure what the IntelliJ keyboard command is, but you can do stuff like that, which is makes things a lot more convenient. One other thing they did was they also made the test framework trait-based in 3.3. However, since you all have older tests, there is a dependency, which I'll add to the slides just because I didn't think about it. But there's a dependency that you can add so that you can actually still run the test the old way with the mix-ins and whatnot. Because basically that's what they had before traits, which was something that Groovy added that was it basically kind of approximated traits, but it had a lot of issues with it. So once they introduced traits, that kind of got deprecated. So Gradle. So in Grails 3, instead of being Gantt based, you got Gradle, which is now it's a lot faster. It has a lot more features in it, so you can just building a war is one command. You can actually also change it by just changing. I think if you just comment out like the war plugin, then you can make a runnable jar. I think you might have to add like another configuration, but there is a tutorial on how to do that, which leads into Docker becoming more interesting because basically there's another plugin which allows you just to build straight to a Docker file and have that in your repository. There's actually I think there's a guide for it. There's also support for things like ASCII Doctor, and this is where if you've looked at how many plugins are in Grails 3 or are in Grails 2 versus 3, you'll find that there's probably about 1,000 in the repository, 1,000 plus for Grails 2, and there's only a couple hundred for Grails 3. Well, a lot of them were build plugins that just went away because they were now they're handled by Gradle plugins. Some of the other ones were just legacy things that no one bothered to port over, but all of the main ones have been ported over for quite a while at this point. So now into some actual code. So JSON Views. Basically, this is another thing that was replaced in Grails. I think it replaces it almost completely in Grails 3.3. Or in some of the profiles, instead of doing the as JSON, which you're probably familiar with, for you do get a map of whatever it was you wanted to do. You do as JSON and render that out. Basically, that has been deprecated. There is a plugin for it, so like if you still need it in your code and you don't want to upgrade to JSON Views, you can still get it back. But JSON Views was something that they the Grails team came up with, which was fast. While it relies on metaprogramming, they actually made a they did something with the what was it, the AST, which basically made their own compiler. So all of these are statically compiled. You can do templates like similar to GSPs. There's things like HAL support and stuff like that. So with this, like you can have something like a model, which is what you pass into, rendering it similar like you would render a GSP, which I have like a list of results. And they, like with their documentation, I found that they use their templates, which you can look up how to do this the template way, where actually instead of like iterating over it, it delegates it to a template. So what I didn't like with that was because since I had a list, it's like I just want to iterate through that in one spot and not have to have a separate template file for two files just to render something. So, but I found that there was a way to do iteration. Basically, if you take set it up with this type of syntax, which is I'm taking sprocket, which is just the name of it, which is the name of the key within the JSON. And I'm pushing in the results here, and it'll iterate over these, and basically these will be the keys. So I have an ID, which is the sprocket ID, and the material, which is the sprocket's material. So that's one thing I found, which is a little nice that I didn't find easily in the documentation, which I should probably add to the documentation, because anyone here can go there and submit a pull request and add to it, which is something that is probably a good thing to mention. And there's also some HAL features, which these, like HAL is basically, it's a JSON structure, but it gives you give it like your front end links to things, so that it becomes like the front end can become aware of what you have and how to pull things in and stuff like that. In my last company, they used a variation of this. They actually made their own HAL support because they found that this wasn't sufficient, because like a lot of things in Grails, it's very targeted to the domain classes. So if you're doing things that combine multiple domain classes and you're not using has manys and stuff because of performance reasons or something like that, you might run into some edge cases and issues. I know that they have been updating it readily, and I think that Constantine released the code for this, so it's somewhere out there on GitHub. I don't remember where, but there's another version of HAL support that can be used with the JSON Views, which my last company released. So I might find that and post a link at some point. So next, built-in. This is actually going to be in both my talks. I added it here just because interceptors are. Whoa.
So the JSON views, do they sit on top of controller?
They're not. Yeah, I do have examples, so I can. Let's go to my code, and if I go over here, so. And I know this is going to be hard to see the structure. I don't know if I can scroll in. No, I can't scroll into the structure. Let's see. So views. So over here, which you can't see it, but there are views over here. And if I go to like my Sprocket one, which was my example, I have an index.json, which is over here. And basically, they're just, instead of having GSP, they're .gson, so JSON Views. And basically, within the controller, let's see, where's my controllers? Grails app, command objects, controllers, which one was it in? I think Sprocket controller. So this basically with this, I'm just returning a map, which is my results, which is a list of sprockets. So you can also use the render command just as you would like any of the GSPs. So you can say render this specific template, and it'll render whichever one you want. Which can be useful if you don't want it to go by the convention of whatever your method is. So this is obviously the index one, which will go to the index view by default. So very similar conventions as the GSPs. So yep. Basically, what you do is you'd have a URL mapping for whatever your API is. It hit the controller and render out the JSON view, which would just render out JSON text.
Is there a convention, like convention?
Yeah.
For the file names?
Yeah. It's the same as the GSPs. So basically, since this is the index controller, it'll go to the index one. But like I said, you can use render as you would before and specify a template name, and you can go to render that specific template rather than the convention. Because with this one, I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff because this is, I'm just playing around with sprockets and my enforcer stuff. But this one, I'm just returning a map, which by default will get rendered to that particular view. But I could also do like a, just so I can show you this, live not used to this keyboard. So render, and then we can do template, and this would be, in this case, would be index, and then I could do, what was it? Oh, shoot. Space, comma, model. Yes. I can blow it up. Hold on. So let's see. What am I? Oh yeah, I'm missing a quote. So you could do this instead. If you didn't want to use the convention, you can say render template, which is index with the model of this. And actually, that should work in theory. So it should be something like that. But I just went with the convention one, which was this. So. Okay, so.
Another question. The
Yes.
socket has to be a model, base model, or it can be any map.
It can be, I believe it can be a list, it can be a map. It's pretty much anything that you pass in. They are, it is, by default, the JSON views are statically compiled, which you can technically turn off, but, it does want you to use, like, things that map to real objects. But, like, it could be a map. That shouldn't be an issue. Any other questions?
Is there any benefit over this using add JSON?
Yes. It's this is much more performant. Like I said, it's actually, let me go back to the other slide. So it's statically compiled. Basically you have things templated, so it kind of decouples your JSON, or I should just say JSON, into views. So it's a little you can see it as like decoupling it, and it's more performant. So if you have like a little JSON like this, yeah, you're probably not going to see much. But if you have like a big JSON document, this would probably be better than the latter.
What we were doing here was we had something called resources, which was like just a map we created.
Yeah.
And like we were on at controller level, and we were rendering it as JSON.
Yep.
Probably some we can go.
Yeah, you could definitely migrate to this. And like I said, there is the backwards compatibility. There's a plugin for like the old converters. So if you're on like a newer version of Groovy, you can. There's also a plugin for the JSON Views, which you need to hook up. To use them. But you can use them side by side and migrate slowly. Which is probably a better way than migrating everything at the same time, depending on if you have time to do it in your project. So. All right, so interceptors. These basically took over for filters. They're kind of like filters on steroids. So they're tied into your Grails app. You can inject services, call out to whatever you want. It could be a place where you could do some parameter checking, some redirects. It's a good place for like a redirect to a EULA, because you want basically you want to set this up so that basically this happens like every time. Actually, I'll go to code, so you can see what one. Oh, that's the header one. Let's go to the security one, and we'll blow that up and move this over. So you have interceptors, which are usually kept in the same folder that the controllers are. I put them off into their own separate package just because I like to kind of separate them out. But that's my own personal issue with them. Basically, they have different matchers, and I chose the match all, and I'm excluding specific ones because they're there are times where you want to exclude things from, like, if you're doing certain things in your interceptors that, say you're doing certain parameter checks that you don't want to happen in, like, your login or something like that. You can also do excludes by URIs, by controllers, by actions. There's a whole bunch of different things that different ways you can set this up. Then you have different handles like before, after. I think there are a few other ones, but the main ones are before and after. And in here I just had, like, some basic things where I'm logging the request URI, the parameters, and I commented out the JSON one because I have to figure out how to do this. I did something similar to this in like an actual web filter earlier on in my career. Because if you do this and then you try to get JSON in your controller, the JSON will come out as null because you've already used it here. So it's kind of like you get it once. So doing it here means I won't get it in my controller, which is why I commented it out, because that was kind of a problem. Another thing that I found in one of the companies I worked for, which doesn't look like it's still a major issue in the latest version, but if you have anything that throws an exception, you want to wrap it and deal with it here, because this expects you just to send a Boolean back. It doesn't expect exceptions. And in one case, in one particular app where an exception was thrown, we started getting our log files filling up with gigabytes of information because it got caught in a hot loop of trying to go to, I think it was the error controller, and it just never got there because it kept bombing out in the interceptor. So that basically, moral of the story, anytime you have, basically you probably want to wrap the whole thing with a try catch, and if it fails, return false or something like that. Deal with it in some particular way. But you can do things like, say, redirect to a controller if you wanted to do something like that. Like this is my little EULA example. I'm calling out to a EULA service which doesn't exist, redirecting to a controller and returning false. So that's one thing you can do within here. So that's where, obviously when I get back to this in my security talk, that's where that comes in security-wise. So... All right. Next, events. Events are something cool that they added, and they've updated them fairly recently. These allow you to spawn off events based on various code that you have, and these will become like asynchronous. So I can have something like a publisher where this is creating an event which will return a map. And basically for this, I'm grabbing the current request, and I'm grabbing the agent, and I'm grabbing the current username, and what was context? Context was whatever was passed into this method. So I'm publishing this event over here, and then I'm subscribing to user.event, which I believe. This is publishing user.event. You can have it do a convention based on the method naming, but I figured I wanted something a little longer than that, and so this is another way of doing that. And basically, I'm getting the map that I published over here, and I'm just doing a bunch of log statements. So one thing to be careful with this is since it will decouple it from your code, if you're doing anything where, like here, I'm pulling off the request and a particular field from that request, if you pass the request in, by the time it gets over here, that request might be gone. So you probably want to just send over primitives like int long string or objects like string. Not complex objects, because you don't know. You might end up with, especially if it's something that Spring manages, it might be gone by the time it gets over here. So, one thing to keep in mind. But this, gives you, just a way to decouple your code from the current thread. There's also wait a minute. Did I just copy that same slide? There's also Gorm events, which and then there was another way to do events, which I do have in my code. If I go to, this is why I have code, but damn is it hard to read that. Traits, services, consumer, publisher, yes. So there is another way to basically do these, which was the old way, which uses notify, which gives you a little bit more flexibility of where you do it in your code. However, they changed it. This used to be included in services and controllers by default in Grails 3.2, and they took it away. Now you have to do implement the event publisher trait to get this back in there, because they went with the annotation route instead as the default. But you can add this particular trait and do notify this way, and then in your consumer, I have let's see. Oh wait a minute, those are different. Where is it? So I have event bus aware, and with this I can actually do a post construct init and actually register this event, subscribe to this event, which is the other way of doing it. So this is one of the basically another way, which gives you I'd say this the receiver doesn't give you any more flexibility, so you might want to just go with the annotation one rather than doing this. But the for the publisher, doing the notify does give you a little bit more flexibility of where you actually source any particular event. So going back, Gorm events. So this was another thing that they added, I think, in 3.3, which allows you to listen to events that Gorm gives off. This became kind of particularly interesting because by default in Grails 3.3, it no longer supports auto wiring in domain classes. The reason they did this was because auto wiring it uses up a lot of memory, and they found in a lot of applications eliminating it from domain classes would probably drop. I think in some cases it dropped the memory by half for your application, so it was very significant. So what they did instead was they used things like events. So say you wanted to add the last user that's something modified, but you didn't want to pass that into the constructor to your domain object every time. You didn't want to have a developer have to remember that. What you can do is they added this @listener, and you can set it to a particular. Oops. I can't double click on that because it's not code. Basically, you can set it to a domain, and then there's there's on pre-insert, after, and all the things that you would normally expect. And then there's the event, which you can actually take and say set a particular property. In this case, I'm setting a manufacturer, and I'm overriding it with a particular value. So, and you can also, I have this set up just so that in code, if you run it, you can see log statements of, oh, this was the before and after. There's also, if I go back to the code, I had in I think it was the consumer, there's also a subscriber. The listener ones are synchronous. Subscriber is asynchronous. So this gives you the ability to actually pull events. This one might be better for if you're doing something in the realm of auditing or something like that. But this one you will not be able to actually update the domain object because it's asynchronous. You're off the thread. It's meant for a different purpose. But since the listener ones are synchronous, those are ones where you could say, add in like, you know, the last modified user or something like that. So things that you would, anything that you would call out to another service in your domain object, you'd want to do within a listener structure for like performance reasons, or actually not for performance, for memory reasons. No, well, it's Gorm based. Yeah, but Gorm is not the same as Hibernate. No, it's built on top of Hibernate, but it doesn't necessarily have to. But anyways, it's related to those. But the event and bus structure, I think that was introduced in Grails. I want to say 3 something. I don't remember exactly. But they changed it so that in Grails 3 they made it like originally it was based off of reactor events from Spring Boot, but they changed it so now that you can swap in whatever you want. You can use reactor, you can use gpars, you can use RxJava. So, you know, by default I think it uses. I don't remember what it uses by default, but it might still use React. I don't think it uses Reactor. It might use gpars or something like that. But it has a default in there that you can just use. And if you want to change it, you can. You can give it more threads. You know, there's ways to manipulate the underlying. So, talked about the Gorm events, and there's a link to the guide. So Spring Boot features. These I'll actually demonstrate. So Spring Boot adds a whole bunch of URLs. You have to actually enable these because by default Grails doesn't enable them. And you'll actually have to go into your configuration to add them for security. So actually I'll show that in application.groovy. And so, you know, assuming you have Spring Security, you know, I added static rules for basically all of these in here, and I just added them to the admin role, which I already have set up. And these give you a whole bunch of information. So let's see, I need do I have, yeah. But I have to be on this one, so. Oh, no. No. Go back. Shit. Okay. I screwed that up, so I'm going to bring that back. Oh, I'm trying to click on the wrong thing. And I'm going to open a new window. Log in, so this is very secure, me password, and then this is one of them. This is the info one, which you'll see like the Grails version, the version of the app, the name of the app, and I added a specific plugin to Spring Boot, which is the get one, which gives me what commit this was and what branch it was when it was built, which can be very useful. You know, there's also like, what was it, ENV for the environment, which gives you a whole bunch of like environmental information. So let's go. Oh, wait a minute. Pull this out of the way. So there's ones for beans, configuration properties, health, loggers, metrics, and mappings. I know this gets extended in like the newer version of Spring Boot because I tried to load all the URLs they had, and you know, I think 2 of them didn't work because they were too new for the version of Grails. But with these, you know, it gives you a lot of just like information, which your DevOps person would love to have this so that they can monitor things like, you know, metrics, health, and stuff like that. Plus, it also gives you, you know, the ability to get some information for debugging. like, obviously the git commit of whatever it is you're running in production could be useful at some point. It's like, what was it that was deployed on QA that no one remembers? It's like, oh, do I have to go through and dig through Jenkins? No, I can just go right here and pull that off. So those are particularly useful. Data services. So this is going to be, let's see. I just want to get all right, I'm doing good on time. So I think this is the last particular topic for the Grails 3 stuff, and then I'll take a little bit of a break in between. So data services. This is a new thing that was added to Grails 3.3, and more specifically, I think it was GORM 6.1. So what these are is basically the Grails people found that a lot of people had no idea what they were doing with transactions. So they made it so that you could write an interface like this and say things like get sprocket, it takes along, and I annotate this with a service so it knows that, oh, this is an AST transform, which will actually make the class for this, like the implementation, so that I can call this method and it will set it to a read-only transaction and pull that off for me. Also, things like like by default with Grails, when you're updating an object, what you do is you usually pull the object in to a domain class, and then you change one property, and then you do a .save, right? Well, what that does in actuality is it takes it and it takes all of the parameters and posts that back to the database. So it's not updating just the field you changed, it's updating all of them, despite the fact that it's, whether they're all dirty or not. GORM does a lot to try to minimize this, but there's only so much it can do. So with this, it also does like smart updates. So if you're updating one field, it'll know and it'll update just the one field. So that's one of the reasons why you might want to use this. Another thing that it added was JPAQL, which looks very similar to HQL annotation. So you could do an @query and do basically the query that you would want for your particular whatever it is, your method, and it would run create the right code to actually run that for you. I know there's also a join annotation, and it is particularly becomes more interesting if you're thinking about going into their multi-tenancy stuff, because with multi-tenancy stuff you have to deal with setting up proper transactions and setting them up so that they go to the right data source and stuff like this, where this one, if you just do @current tenant, it will set all that up for you under the hood and just execute your query. Another thing you can do is this one's an interface, but it could be an abstract class, so you can mix and match. You could do like an abstract method and use like some of the data service stuff, but then have like say another method that calls that pulls like maybe a few of these together. And these things are also, they have you can also add @transactional to them and manipulate what the transaction is doing if you wanted to. But the reason like I said, the reason they added this was a lot of people, and I'm included in this, have written like a getter that just does a get within like a transactional service, but didn't use read only with it. So this is kind of going like a step further of like getting the idea that of decoupling your querying from your other logic, because what I've seen, what I've heard from some other people who know a lot more than even I do, is, and actually I kind of see this and it seems like a good idea, but to it'd be a good idea to segregate your data logic, what you're doing in data, from like your actual business logic. So that's one thing that some people have been doing. And that's basically all I really know about data services. There is a, if you go on YouTube, there is a Gretsch link, conference link, which has a like 50-minute talk on this, which can go into way more depth than I'm going to go into right now. So, but questions? For like the Grails filler part, which is about 45 minutes so far. Okay. What's that? Interface or abstract. Those are your two choices. Basically, because the interface, everything in the interface is abstract, and it knows that because of that service annotation, it knows, oh, I'm going to take this interface and I'm going to construct the real service for you, and fill in the methods. Which it knows that there are a bunch of these that you can use. Like I'm using get, but you can also use finds, updates. There's a whole bunch of documentation on this as well. What's that? No. Basically, with this. This particular thing will create a sprocket service that you can inject into any other service or controller. Yeah, just an injection like any other service that you'd have. Yep.
Just curious if there's events, Meteor, if you know Meteor framework at all?
Meteor framework.
One of the
I've heard of it, and I don't remember
One of
much.
the things it does is it monitors like database logs, or I guess they are, and it'll actively push changes out as a publish event.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, does Grails do any kind of active database pushes, turn database updates into publish events?
Well, the GORM events would be the database. GORM is their data. Actually, I should say data store layer, because it could be Mongo or anything. But they push those push events, so that would be probably on that level, the level of what you'd be looking for with that. But like I said, there's two different kinds of those. There's the asynchronous ones, which you can't do any updates, and then the synchronous ones, which is the listener ones, which you can do like updates to the thing that it's actually saving. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Then I'm going to stop the